times change and places have to either change themselves or have the ability to allow different things to go on within them. And I think that's the key to creating a successful place.
Welcome to the Purpose of Place podcast. I'm Despina Katsikakis, your host, and I'm delighted to welcome my guest today, the chairman of Related Argent, David Partridge. David, you are the developer, owner, and operator of over 21 million square feet across the UK, some of the most significant regeneration schemes, including, of course, King's Cross, where we're at today, which has, it's fair to say, transformed London over the past 20 years. And I'm just going to kick off by saying, looking across this incredible legacy going back to Brindley Place in Birmingham, how important was making a social impact?
Probably 20 years ago, that wasn't the top of anybody's agenda. Times change and places have to either change themselves or have the ability to allow different things to go on within them. And I think that's the key to creating a successful place. I do hope the places that we've worked in will have that ability to evolve kind of built into them so that they, it's not quite as traumatic perhaps as it has been for some other places that had to kind of really start from scratch almost because their original premise has become almost completely, kind of out of date. Literally.
If I think about both Brindley Place and King's Cross, you started with sort of the public realm in terms of creating a sense of belonging for the community and inviting people to be a part of this. So it was almost the reverse rather than creating a self-contained.
Well, I always joke and say the only reason we built the public realm was because we didn't have enough money to build an actual building. So we sort of started with the public realm and then we
found having created cheaper.
The place. We then became much easier to build to fund the buildings themselves.
Yes.
But no, joking apart, it's actually quite interesting. The master plan that we inherited for Brindley Place was very deliberately around creating a central square which was the address, and that was going to be sort of 1 Brindley Place, 2 Brindley Place, 3, and those were the office addresses in that sort of. I remember this was mid-90s, and then off to around the edge were all the other things that went on, and we rather drastically kind of came up with this idea that actually some of those other things that go on, which might be restaurants or or cafes and things like that, actually should maybe be in the central square rather than just sort of pushed to the outside as a sort of secondary players. So we built a cafe right in the middle of the square, and then I remember we actually put a restaurant on the ground floor of one of the buildings, number 4 Brindley Place.
That is radical. Making the building permeable,
which was really radical. It was like an idea. It's like, what? You're wasting what could be great frontage, which should be a front door. And we said, no, we can put up the front door at one end, and we can put a restaurant at the other end. That was the first mixed-use office building that had been created for a very, very long time. And obviously, we've taken that to much more extremes here at King's Cross, where every single ground floor is about what's happening to the public realm. It's not about office entrances. It's all about activity. Yeah. And that's one of the ways to make the place sort of feel like it's alive.
How resilient were some of those decisions when COVID came and everyone started saying, well, people, don't need to go back to the offices? What was your experience here?
Well, actually, what was really interesting was that while it's and even post-COVID, it's taken a while for a lot of our office tenants to come back. They are now pretty well here at least 4 days a week, if not more. People loved it here because of the public realm. So this was a place where people could actually come. They could congregate at a social distance. We had lots of space for people to sit around the canal. As soon as the restaurants were allowed to be opened again, if you remember, people were allowed to sit outdoors.
Yeah.
We'd sort of built the cafe culture, the outdoor culture into the very master plan itself.
And you'd build the kind of the why. Why is this a destination? Because there are activities, there are events, there's a surprise element to what you might encounter by coming to King's Cross as a destination.
Yeah, I think we've continued with that. If you go out there today, we're just starting up the Summer Sounds program, which is in the Coal Drops Yard. Last week, we were dismantling the Olympics fan zone was here for the whole of the Olympic Games. So, so there's always been something to do, and that's been fundamental too.
So one of the big challenges, of course, today is how do investors create attractive income out of offices? Mm-hmm. And a lot of what you're describing is around creating a very different experience that almost in a way grounds the reason for people to come back to their offices. What are your lessons learned as a developer?
We've been lucky that we've been able to really have a huge, monopoly board to play with almost, in the sense that we don't have just single assets standing on their own, where it's not so easy to necessarily create much kind of atmosphere around them. Big multi-use assets, they're multi-phased assets. There's over 50 buildings here at King's Cross. And so we've been able to build up, while the main income comes from the office lettings here, and there's around 3.5-4 million square feet in total of gross of office space here. The reason that people want to come here is not necessarily about specifically for each one of those individual offices, as you say. It's about everything else that's to do with King's Cross. A lot of that is the public realm. A lot of that is the activity and the buzz. Combine that, by the way, with a place that's incredibly well located in terms of transport. It's very easy to get here or to come here but on the way to somewhere else. But actually the other elements, coming back to what we're talking about in terms of the E and the S, is that actually we maintain a program of real environmental responsibility through our aspirations to achieve net zero carbon. Our currently we're at carbon neutrality, and we involve all the office occupiers, and we hope the actual people who are running the offices and occupying the offices in that. And we also have a really strong social program, which again we involve all our tenants and their staff in as well. So people don't just feel that this is a great place to come because there's somewhere to grab a coffee on the way, do a little bit of shopping, bring your family at the weekend and all that, which is good in itself. But they actually feel that they're part of a community, and that community is giving something back to the community around it. And I think that that's actually really important for people who live, who are working in offices nowadays, to see that that their bosses, their businesses, the companies that they work for feel that they're invested in a place beyond just sort of for the sake of the of the work that they do.
So a bigger sense of purpose.
It is all about purpose. Absolutely.
So that leads me to think about two areas. One, you talk about the mix and the variety of uses on the site. And one of the things that's becoming interesting is, where does the value sit? Is it in the individual building? Or are we moving to think about the value of the precinct and the overall combination of spaces? Because no doubt the activation, the sense of belonging, the community, all of the things you describe are inevitably increasing the value of the individual office buildings within the development. So in a way, the precinct starts driving a much greater value for the individual asset.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really interesting, because it's time, as you say, because valuers, have a really tough time. They have to go out and do a red book on the basis of transactions. Mm-hmm. Most transactions will be on a building by building basis. I think where the precinct value, as you come, or the estate as we call it, comes in, is when they then go, okay, so when I add all those assets together and I look at the blend and the mix, and I look at the resilience and the kind of more of the risk adjusted rate that says, okay, how much of a void am I going to build into my, my discounted cash flow if and when one of the floors of this building comes up, how quickly do I think it's going to relet? How quickly do what sort of rent freeze am I going to end up? That's where I think the adjustment comes. And that's where they can say, this place, this building on its own, because it happens to be part of this bigger estate, actually is going to be far more resilient and is going to let much quicker because it's got the environmental credentials, because the place has got the social credentials, because, blah, blah, blah. And that's where I think the risk-adjusted rate can come down against a simple yield play that just says, oh, yeah, there's, 4.25% around the corner, so that's what I'm going to use for this one. And that's where we see the blended yield across the whole estate.
So the environmental and social investment that you've made on the sites that you've been working on actually underpin the profitability that you have.
I think so. Absolutely. And I remember having conversations about this sort of 2 to 3 years ago when people were sort of saying, well, if I have to put some money into an E or an S, it means that I'm inevitably losing money elsewhere. Why would I do that? And my answer has always been, well, certainly in the property world, the E and the S reinforce the value rather than work against the value.
Well, you're clearly very passionate about that because you're chairman of the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard.
Yeah.
And that is an industry initiative. One of the challenging questions is who's responsible ultimately to deliver these?
Well, it's a good point because government has passed. The one thing that Theresa May did manage to do was to commit this country to achieving net zero by 2050. And so government has said we will do it. People have been kicking it down the road. We just can't any longer. So actually, this is what's so wonderful about the Net Zero Carbon Building Standard initiative is that it is the market that has decided that it needs this, and it's the market that is promoting it, and it's the market that is adopting it, because the market has said, we all know that we need to achieve this. We realize we need to achieve it because our customers want it. We realize that society wants it, and we would like to measure ourselves properly against everybody else. So can we please have just one standard so that everybody can benchmark themselves against that? We as, responsible members of a society, B, of the built environment universe, want to come up with something that we will voluntarily put together, and we will voluntarily subject our assets to this in the hope that one day government will come along and say, okay, great, Part Z of the building regs or whatever it might be, as and when that happens, or if there's planning legislation or whatever, guess what? There's a completely, thoroughly science-based system that is in place, which we can adopt, which has been, rigorously and properly put together, and something which we might as well, say that's the standard that everybody should be using, because hopefully the government, the industry is already using it.
But I think it's very exciting that the industry is taking that collective responsibility to drive this agenda.
Yes.
Particularly given the role that the industry plays in carbon.
Yeah.
So I think
it's a massive contributor.
Yes, exactly. We are one of the major.
Our guilt conscience that's coming through one way or another. No, but again, that it's also feeling responsible, being responsible for the impact that you have, and then doing something about it.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think you could apply that to social aspects as well. We have, I guess, in the past, the industry has been seen to be a bit of a sort of leech on society rather than a contributor to society, or in some ways. That's certainly the way it's portrayed or has been portrayed. It's absolutely not the truth. We know that from our experience with all the people that we work with. And so to be, consciously measuring our impact and looking to demonstrate the benefits that we deliver to the economy, to society, to the environment, etc.
And as you said earlier, it actually is good for business. It's good for society. It's good for the environment, for people, and for business.
Yeah.
And what's particularly fascinating to me is when we talk about the relationship of the landlord to the occupier, to the tenant. And that relationship historically has been a business-to-business relationship. You mentioned earlier how the employees of the companies that occupy your buildings feel they're connected to a wider sense of purpose because they are part of what you're delivering in terms of the sustainability agenda, the social agenda that the site is contributing to. So in a way, your customer has changed.
Yes.
And as an industry, we are becoming more a B2C industry.
Yeah.
And those customers have very different sets of expectations. How have you changed the skills, the people that you employ, the services that you provide as a landlord to adapt to that changing relationship?
Well, we're in a completely different industry. 20 years ago, I know we employed kind of an architect, a contractor, a QS, a planner, 2 or 3 people who would kind of raise the funds and some lawyers who would sign the leases, and that would be it, because you put in place your 5, 10, 15, probably 15 to 25 year lease and then hand it on and go, right, that's it, I've done my work. I'll come back in 5 years' time and hope that the rest of the market has buoyed things up, and then I'll get a nice big rent review. Thank you very much. That's completely gone away. And it's not just in the office sector, is it? It's happening in every other sector. More and more of kind of direct services are being provided in the residential sector. Amenity added activities are fundamental to the way people live and work. People want to be able to walk into a place where they feel that that they can do anything that they like, that they're there because they want to enjoy being at this place. So
one of the challenging issues is that investors are still looking at single asset classifications. So even if they look at a complex site, they'll break it down and say they'll want to invest in the residential or in the office. And what you've been describing is a need to think about much more mixed asset classes that bring together that complexity to drive value. What do you see the challenges are that this single asset focus is posing today?
Well, you can see today that it's really hard to get a new office development off the ground. I think the stats on new starts over the last 2 or 3 years are significantly down on pre-COVID, and this is, I think, as a result of exactly as you say, investors finding it really hard to be in love with this particular sector on its own. And so people are inevitably moving to more alternative approaches. And some of that, is the sort of thing that we've been talking about, whether it's co-working or co-living or whatever. And so the answer to that is to begin to start moving towards multiple phased projects where you get a mix of different activities that are going on. And dare I say it, going back to your old DEGW days of kind of, long life, loose fit, build buildings that can be changed over time. And, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time can potentially be repurposed. And, it goes back to what we did right at the beginning, which was design the outside spaces first in such a way that actually the individual buildings, don't matter so much in their own right, and what's going on in them isn't the thing that's driving the external, the quality of the place. It's what's going on the ground floor and what's going on outside. And so if it's people are living there or working there or doing something else up there on the upper floors, you don't really notice it. So I think that's where we we need to be clever, that we're designing buildings that are more resilient, that are more capable of being, reimagined over time.
So that level of resiliency of creating places that allow society to evolve, you started with that.
Yes.
We have evolved in terms of the expectations of society, technology, work over the decades that you have been developing places.
And I think it neatly goes back to what we were talking about right at the very beginning, which is you need to create a place that can evolve.
So, David, I think we've covered quite a lot. And I particularly like that you went back to the old DHW ideas of long life, loose fit. And certainly that notion of time, the layers of layering the building decisions with time remain enormously critical. But is there one or two other things that you think are urgent for us as an industry to be doing today if we are responsible for creating places for people and society to thrive?
I think the net zero carbon agenda is really urgent. Well, I think there's an awful lot of work in the technical aspects of getting that right. I think the other thing, which again we have touched on, is this idea of buildings, for or developers and owners as service providers, not as landlords in the old sense. I think that's going to be really important for people to continue to develop that thinking and to see themselves as almost as part of the kind of hospitality industry around how you have to attract people to your places, your buildings, and what you have to put into those buildings, and the image you have to portray around the ease of occupation for those those assets.
Sort of implies a partnership with the customer.
Yes.
As opposed to a transaction.
The whole way people live and work is changing so radically that the people who should be providing for that, aren't necessarily, us lot who perhaps created a wonderful place for what we wanted 5, 10, 15 years ago, but aren't necessarily, we need to start giving more power to that next generation.
Absolutely.
And support them to come up with their vision for what living and working is going to be like in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. Because we'll be very surprised when it comes.
Well, I have to say, I am very encouraged at the enthusiasm and energy. And we both have a legacy with the BCO.
Yes.
And it's incredible to see the next gen, which is a third of the BCO now, and just the energy that they're putting into exactly creating that set of expectations for the industry and for what the industry produces. So I'm hugely encouraged by that. Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. As always, thank you so much for making the time, and thank you for just creating such inspiring places.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed. As I say, it's a real privilege and an honor, and lovely to have the opportunity to make these great places for people to enjoy and always to learn more, because I think that's the main thing. Is like, it ain't ever finished. Cities never stop evolving. Places never stop. Needing more and more attention. And I think the moment you think you've got it right and done and dusted, then that's it. You should stop, because there's always more to do.